Hello everybody, this is TJR. It's the age-old question, who is better, the Beatles or the Stones? And it would appear that just the other day, Sir Paul McCartney himself decided to tell everybody that it's the Beatles. So let's talk about this. Now, I'm going to first read and interject throughout this article here from Rolling Stone. Headline reads, Paul McCartney explains to Howard Stern why the Beatles were better than the Stones. And let me just read this here. Paul McCartney phoned into the Howard Stern show Tuesday morning for a wide-ranging conversation that touched on everything from his love of Billie Eilish to his life during the quarantine to the Beatles' ancient rivalry with the Rolling Stones. Stern suggested that the Beatles were a better band, and McCartney didn't disagree. Now, I do recommend you listen to this on YouTube. You can actually listen to the conversation. And it's important to understand how Stern phrased the question. He didn't ask Paul McCartney, who's better, the Beatles or the Stones? He basically said, I, Howard Stern, believe that the Beatles were the better band. And then asked him, do you agree? Now, I wouldn't presume to know what it's like to be hugely, hugely famous. I don't even know what it's like to be minorly famous, to be quite honest. But I would assume that this is the type of a question that you want to avoid because you're naturally going to have your own bias for your own band. God only knows I always do. But answering it in that way could appear to be very arrogant and egotistical. And I don't care what you tell me about Kanye West. There is no good and flattering way to publicly display that type of attitude or behavior. Now, if this were just any random reporter asking him this question, he could have probably very easily brushed it off with a neutral comment like, well, you're asking me to compare apples to oranges, and they're both very good at what they do. But this is not just some random reporter. This is Howard Stern. Paul McCartney has done a number of in-depth interviews with Howard Stern. And like Stern or not, these interviews are fascinating to listen to. But bottom line, these two men have discussed a lot publicly between each other on a national forum. And McCartney probably realizes that more than likely, Howard Stern is not going to let him brush off a question like that. So at this point, McCartney really only has two choices. He could take the modest route and say, oh no, the Stones were the better band. He is going to let down big time Beatles fans around the world who believe otherwise, and he's going to get a lot of flack for it, actually. So I think he instead makes the right choice and allows what would be his own natural bias, and nothing wrong with it. It should be his bias that the Beatles were better. He lets that decide what to say, and he says, yeah, I think the Beatles are better. I'm going to go back to the article here, and basically it quotes here, you know you're going to persuade me to agree with that one. And he says it very tongue-in-cheek. So once again, there's some tongue-in-cheek humor there. It kind of comes off not quite so arrogant when he says it that way. The article goes on to say, they are rooted in blues when they are writing stuff. It has to do with the blues. We had a little more influences. There's a lot of differences. And I love the Stones, but I'm with you. The Beatles were better. Now, I'm going to interject at this point. Definitely, the blues are at the bedrock of the sound of the Rolling Stones. Keith Richards himself has also stated that the music, rock and roll music, I should say, of his youth, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, but for Keith Richards, mostly Chuck Berry, definitely influenced him, and that also traditional country music was a huge influence on him as well. But these musical influences that I have just stated, early rock and roll, country music, the blues, most musicians will tell you that these three genres are all kind of musical kissing cousins. And make no mistake that these three kissing cousins also influenced the Beatles. But when you listen to their albums and when you listen to how they get more experimental, you definitely see that there was a much wider range of musical influences that you can hear in the Beatles' music. And I'm not saying the Stones didn't occasionally flirt with other things. They definitely did, and they definitely still do. But it's much more pronounced in the Beatles recordings. I'm going to go back to the article now. Stern then brought up the Stones' attempt to create their own Sgt. Pepper-like album in late 1967 with their Satanic Majesty's Request. We started to notice that whatever we did, the Stones sort of did it shortly thereafter, McCartney said. We went to America and we had huge success. Then the Stones went to America. We did Sgt. Pepper, the Stones did a psychedelic album. There's a lot of that. Now I want to circle back to that remark, but let me finish out the quote here. We were great friends, still are kind of. We admire each other. The Stones are a fantastic group. I go see them every time they're out. They're a great, great band. So first I want to stop here and talk about the album Their Satanic Majesty's Request by the Rolling Stones, which has, over the decades, received a lot of criticism that it was their attempt to copy the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. Now, a while back I did a video where I did an in-depth analysis of that album. And I haven't watched that video in a while, and I don't have time to go rewatch it right now, but I do believe that I said that I don't think at any one time that, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards looked at each other and said, hey, let's copy the Beatles. I think that, like a lot of bands from that time period, they heard Sgt. Pepper, and it was a bombshell. I mean, it was a game-changer album, and everybody was kind of taken aback by it at the time. And I think, like a lot of bands and musicians coming up at that time, playing in the same musical scene together, they must have heard Sgt. Pepper, and a lot of them must have thought, wow, this changes everything. All bets are off. There's no more rules anymore as to what makes a good pop album. The sky's the limit. Let's see what we can do. And I want to state again, I don't claim to know anybody in the Rolling Stones. This is all just my personal hypotheses. But I would think that the creation of an album like their Satanic Majesty's Request from the Rolling Stones was really just them hearing that influence. And like all musicians do, we hear something that inspires us and we want to try to do it ourselves, or we do our own spin on it, our own take on it. And I think this holds true regardless of whether or not you think Satanic Majesty's Request is a good album or not. Because I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding that as well. Now, McCartney also mentions that, we went to America and then not long after that, the Rolling Stones went to America. Well, that's just good business sense. When black music artists in America found out that they could get a more appreciative and higher paying audience in England than they could in America, they started going there. And that is part of what led to the Rolling Stones being so influenced by American blues music. And for that reason, I wouldn't call the Rolling Stones going to America as copying the Beatles. That's just a good business decision. It's already been shown to work. Now, even though I've just torn down Paul McCartney's two arguments towards the idea that the Stones copied the Beatles, there is definitely still an argument to be made about that. The earliest period of the Rolling Stones has them covering songs by other writers. And as Mick Jagger and Keith Richards start to come into their own as a songwriting team, there is this brief period where you could make that argument. Between the Buttons, which is the album that precedes Satanic Majesty's Request, does have a much stronger pop feel to it than any previous Rolling Stones album. But it should also be noted that during this time, Brian Jones is still a member of the band. He was a multi-instrumentalist, and he brought a lot of different musical influences into these original songs that Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were writing. And this is typified in songs like Lady Jane, where we have the harpsichord. That's Brian Jones. And these musical similarities begin to completely change with the next album, Beggar's Banquet. And it's at around this time that Brian Jones's involvement, his musical involvement with the Rolling Stones, begins to diminish, leading up to his death. Of course, I do know that this is for some people, a more arguable point, depending on whose recountings of history that you ascribe to. From there, the article goes on to promoting the upcoming Peter Jackson-directed documentary, Get Back, which looks like it's probably going to get moved back a few more months before we see its release. So what do you think? As for me personally, I love them both. But if you had to tell me which one would I take to a deserted island and that's the only catalog I could have, I'd probably still choose the Beatles at this point. And I should add that that is just my subjective opinion. And I should also add that it's okay to disagree with me on that. Also, disagreeing with someone's musical taste does not mean that you now have to question any and every opinion or bit of advice that you have ever heard from them. A disagreement on musical taste does not somehow make everything they've ever said somehow less credible. That's hard for me to believe, but I find more and more this is prevalent on the internet. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, share your thoughts on this, and if you could only have one musical artist's collection available to you on a deserted island, would it be the Beatles or the Stones or someone else entirely? Let us know. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.